I've had a very heavy lunch, as many of you may have, and I hope that our session is going to be more than enough to keep you all awake until the end of it. So let's begin by talking about Vikram's absolutely fascinating novel, which I had the honor of actually writing a blurb for. So Mansur, as many of you may know, is one of the most interesting artists of the Mughal court because he seems to have been a real master at natural imagery. And the way that Vikram's book actually very appropriately begins is with this incredible painting of a dodo. It might not seem like the most interesting of animals to begin a book with, but let me assure you that its story, as well as the story of its maker, the artist Mansur, is absolutely fascinating. It's a magical journey. The reason that I find Mansur so fascinating is because that when you think about the Mughals, everybody thinks about the emperors, right? It's all about, oh, Akbar this or Aurangzeb that. But the reality of the Mughals is that they influenced so many lives far beyond the immediate environs of the court itself. And I think that the idea of using art as a way to tell the story of these individuals who very often come from very humble backgrounds, rise to positions of extraordinary proximity to the emperors, and are simultaneously vulnerable to the politics of the court as well as to politics from each other. So Vikram does this fantastic job really of like bringing Mansur and his world to life. But without any further ado, let me stop talking and let's get into talking about this fascinating artist.
Thanks a lot, actually, and thank you.
My pleasure. My
Anirudh
pleasure.
has a very special relationship with this book. Thank you very much once again for this wonderful advance review you wrote of it.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, BLF. Everything has a story to it. And it's interesting that both of you brought up the dodo to begin with. So, can I just sort of backtrack a little?
Of course, yeah, by all means.
This entire story actually began, yes. Closer, okay, better?
Yeah.
Okay, this story actually began exactly precisely on the evening of the 22nd of August 2015, about a kilometer as the crow flies across the road at the NGMA. On the evening of the 22nd of August 2015, I had the great pleasure of listening to an art historian, Dr. Ashok Kumar Das, who also happens to be an expert and a scholar on Mansur's paintings and life and period. In the course of about an hour or 45 minutes, Dr. Das held his captive audience of 25 to 250 people or so absolutely mesmerized with these images of the most extraordinary birds, animals, and flowers, all done by this man who began his life in the court of Akbar as a humble nakash, which actually means a nakashi person who is a decorator. So in Mansur's case, he started his career sometime in the late 1500s, probably the 1590s, by being an illuminator of manuscripts. That's all the border decorations in gold and with flowers and, you know, the archetypal image one has of a Mughal miniature. Then we move into the new century, the 1600s, and by 1605, Akbar is succeeded by his son Salim, who becomes Jahangir. At the same time, Mansur's star begins to rise. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, because he's worked in the atelier under Akbar's painters and master painters for about 15 to 20 years, and now he moves into a different scenario, both political under Jahangir, as also artistic. So what Jahangir notices in him is this particular man's skill, exceptional skill, in rendering flora and fauna most naturalistically and capturing more than anything else. They're just not beautiful pictures of animals and flowers, but they almost seem to capture the life breath of his subjects. And Mansur becomes almost a foil as an artist to Jahangir's own scientific temperament. There's always been this notion that Jahangir was this dissolute king who inherited an empire and then he drank his life away. We don't know, but that's popular imagination. But what we do know from Jahangir's own writings is that he was actually genuinely interested in why things worked the way they did, why animals looked the way they did and behaved the way they did. And he was particularly enamored of exotic creatures, which were brought into his court by embassies from the West, from Europe, primarily Portugal and England. But coming back to Dr. Das's talk, in the span of 45 minutes, we saw a whole gamut of images. And the very last image known to have been painted by Mansur, who started as Mansur Nakkash and then rose to become Nadir al-Asra, which translates as rarity of the present, Ustad Mansur, Master Mansur, Jahangir Shahi, of the court of Jahangir. And that's how he signed himself. Amal-e Nadir al-Asr, Ustad Mansur Jahangir Shahi, which means the work of in Persian. So the last painting that's known of Mansur's work is this image of a dodo, and this is what Dr. Das started his presentation with. And this particular image of a dodo, which was done in 1627, is widely known to be one of the most accurate representations of a bird which became extinct, a species which became extinct in less than 100 years later. Most other specimens of the dodo that you see in museums in Europe and elsewhere are actually based on skeletal remains or hearsay or descriptions by travelers, because the bird itself was gone by then, and this is believed to be the most accurate representation of this bird. And again, if you look at it, and I urge everybody here to actually look at these paintings, not just Mansur's, but of the entire period, it actually captures something of that bird's jaunty step. There's a funny little smile to his huge hooked bill. He's got a little twinkle in his eye. So it's this realism and this life breath. At the end of that talk, I had just the one question for Dr. Das in the usual Q&A. And that had been, I said, do we know where he was from and where is he buried? The answer, of course, was, we don't know. And so, historical fiction. So that was really the genesis of this book.
There's something so, I find it very emotional that this remarkable person who in so many ways, I'm sure all of us have watched nature documentaries, all of us can identify with just the sheer simplicity and beauty of just seeing nature as it is. It's something that really moves all of us. And to see this individual who many centuries ago had this extraordinary talent for rendering nature so perfectly, and we don't know who he was, where he came from. Of course, Vikram has some ideas in his book, and who essentially, for all intents and purposes, his life outside of the Mughal court, outside of these paintings that were clearly something that he was profoundly passionate about, nothing about him is known. And what I really like about the book is the way that you managed to humanize Mansur and really bring him to life as a living, breathing individual. Of course, I won't go into too much detail about what that individual is like, but I'm curious, Vikram, because not just Mansur, but the entire cast of individuals he is surrounded by, these other artists of the Mughal court, the princes of the Mughal court, the old wives of the Emperor Akbar, and of course of Noor Jahan and Jahangir themselves. How do you write about them not as these caricatures that they're very often reduced to in our modern political discourse, but as almost as tragic figures who, it's profoundly moving to read about them because they seem to have the same kind of internal worlds as we do. They love, they are jealous, they are petty, but they're also inspired and creative. And I just find that so moving about the way the book is written.
Thank you so much for asking me that question. It's very strange, but even in things which I've worked on, this book happened, I wasn't actually actively looking to write about Mansur. It happened and I just had a desire to know more about this person. Because he's known, but yet almost forgotten. Yeah, obliterated from. It's very peculiar, but in all the books which I've, or projects which I've taken on, self-driven adventures, I haven't been so interested in kings and queens and, the elite, the ruling elite, as much as in the subaltern, the people who have no names, anonymity, But these are again people who not only created these empires, but also created works of architecture, works of art, works of music, literature, just about everything. But their names are very conveniently forgotten or not mentioned at all. It's more like by the way. It's almost like just a king or a queen did everything. Yeah?
And that's literally the vocabulary we use is that, oh, such and such king made this temple. He was not the one who was carting the
Under the
stones on his
patronage
back.
of or whatever. Yeah,
Exactly.
but they weren't actually doing the hard work. It was somebody else chipping away at some rock somewhere, or doing this little miniature painting. Yes, for a reason. In this particular case, this gentleman had a very good reason. Like I said, he had a perfect counterpart in a patron who was deeply invested in science, who was deeply invested in art itself, and he was an artist himself and a very literate person, as comes through in his Tuzuki Jahangiri, which you get in two versions. You can read it as the Jahangir Nama or the Tuzuk. But to come back to your question, it is these people, these hidden faces who have always been doing something, and particularly in the Jahangir era, and later on, it was this entire obsession with realism, documenting not just nature, but court scenes, battles, mendicants sitting outside a tent and playing a little instrument or playing some drums, dancers, the entire gamut of life, not only of the elite, but also of everyday people. And these were people who clearly had their own lives, their own very, very rich inner lives. I could be sitting and painting, but I have troubles of other sorts: accommodation, food, water. Am I going to get my salaries on time? Is somebody higher up in the pecking order? Because actually I'm very, very low down. I'm just a worker. Yeah? It's only later that we look at them as greats. But while they're actually doing it, they're just employees at a studio. Yeah? So their preoccupations: am I actually going to survive tonight? If I have a headache or a fever, where am I going to find medication? These are very, very basic human impulses which drive all of us. And that was where my interest actually lies, in looking at the inner lives and the inner stories of these people who leave behind such fabulous legacies which we look at and gasp over, and in museums around the world. I can actually tell you how, if I may tell you how one sort of goes about these things. My primary source was the paintings themselves. The other primary source, of course, in translation, is the Tuzuki Jahangiri, and then, of course, there are other texts, secondary research and all that stuff. But I will come back again and again and again to the paintings, because in a scale of just this much, not just the natural history paintings. Take the court scenes, for example. You look closely, there are these portraits in this archetypal image of the Mughal profile. You very rarely see them foreshortened, or almost never as a full frontal image. But when you look at these things and you give them time, and you approach them with respect, you approach them with empathy, with a tremendous amount of humor, and you can actually get them to start moving around and doing their things for you. So for a historian, it's actually difficult, because they have to be very correct about, citations, this, that, and the other. For a novelist, this is the most fun part, because I can get these chaps and chappies to do exactly what I want them to do. But I do it completely with empathy, and I do it with respect, and I have an objective. Sometimes that roadmap is not very clear. I don't know where I'm going. But once somebody has decided that they're going to speak to you, however woo-woo this sounds, they actually speak. And you just have to listen. You just have to tune in to these voices. And yes, they speak in English, not in Persian. I don't know, I'm sorry, have I gone all over the place with
that's actually
with this?
That's a very touching answer, and I expect nothing less from the one who wrote such a
Oh,
book.
come on, thank you.
But if
Thank you.
there's just so much to unravel here. What I find most striking is this idea that art somehow reveals the inner world of the person who's making it. And I find that very striking because I feel like today we very much take art for granted as something that lives in museums that you sometimes walk up to and you stroke your chin and be like, oh wow, this is so sophisticated. But what is so striking is the idea that art can reveal to you in a way that I suppose words cannot what the person who made it was really like. And this applies from, let's say, the handprints of people living, let's say, 15,000 years ago, who they're living on caves, all the way up to these remarkably sophisticated portraits. And I also find it interesting that you brought up this idea that as much as we might see it as art and something that provokes connoisseurship, to them it was at the end of the day a job.
And yet.
And yet. And I was just thinking that, I used to work in analytics, and I was just thinking that nobody's going to look at an Excel sheet that I made 200 years from now and be like, oh wow, what a profound mind he must.
But you don't know that.
Well, let's hope.
Yeah.
But I want to talk a little bit about the world that Mansur inhabited. Now, we've spoken so much about the inner world that he may have had, but I'm curious, and one thing that I actually really enjoyed about the book is that, as I said in the beginning, he occupies this very strange liminal space where he's not exactly a commoner, he's not exactly vulnerable necessarily to famine the way that the average Mughal subject would have been. But at the same time, his position is very vulnerable because it depends on the equation he has with his patron. And I'm wondering if you could give us a general sense of the kind of lives that Mughal court painters would have led, because they are so often kind of subsumed within the personality of their patron that we don't very often understand the incentives that they would have been responding to within the court itself, and then the interpersonal dynamics that they may have
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, that's a layered question. So I'll take them in whichever layer comes to my mind first. To begin with, somebody like Ustad Mansur, Nadir al-Asr, the rarity of the present, by virtue of his title, and another of his colleagues who's named Nadiruz Zaman, the rarity of the age, is a colleague, a younger colleague, Abul Hasan. By virtue of the fact that these were given, they were both bestowed imperial titles by the emperor himself, meant that they were mansab holders, which means they had positions of some kind of authority, especially when it came to going out into battle and what have you. Though, of course, nothing of that sort really happened. Not too much of that happened, because Jahangir had very conveniently delegated all of that responsibility to Khurram to take care of from Burhanpur, basically against the Deccan. These mansabs had men. They could have been 30 men, 40 men, whatever it was. They'd become like a personal army, and there'd be a stable of horses assigned to each of these mansab holders, depending on where they were positioned in the mansab system. So that meant that they contributed their men and their horses to become this massed army in times of. So Mansur, by virtue of his title, like Abul Hasan, would have had some level of privilege, but not so much that he can sit back and, laze around or do his own thing. He's still working at the court atelier. He's still an ordinary subaltern. Yeah. The other question you asked was the dynamic between, did you say?
The interpersonal dynamics of the court.
It couldn't have been easy at all, by no stretch of the imagination. I mean, just like any of us who are in any kind of professional situation which involves a lot of people, a pecking order, somebody up there looking down and assigning roles and responsibilities. In this case, the chief librarian and the keeper of the keeper of paintings was called Maktab Khan, and that was the name of the man in charge of what's called the Kitab Khana and the Karkhana. So they would have been reporting directly to Maktab Khan, and Maktab Khan would have been telling them what paintings to do, what folios to work on, what calligraphies to work on, which book they'd be working on. One of the most fascinating things about the period and its painters, that almost all of them worked in collaboration with their colleagues. So it wasn't always just one person. Mansur maybe to an extent with his natural history portraits and paintings, but a lot of them which involved human portraits and court scenes were and even mythological stories or stories from the various parables worked in collaboration. So it wasn't one individual, somebody, I would do the outlines, you would be painting the inside. This gentleman there would be doing the border, and somebody else would be doing the sky. Yeah, so it was a collaborative experience, and all of them invariably wrote all these paintings, almost all of them, correction, are inscribed. So you know that sky is by so-and-so, drawing is by so-and-so, color work is by so-and-so. So clearly there's a very, very vibrant dynamic at work over here. But within that, it couldn't have all been easy. Maybe I don't like you very much. Yeah, and you don't, and vice versa. So we've got our personal little problems where it's like any other normal workplace. And that again becomes interesting. Because outwardly, everything is so serene and formal. Yeah? You asked me something else in the same...
No, I forgot myself actually. Because
sorry, I talked too much.
But what you're saying is just so interesting because I don't think I've ever come across a book that actually makes middle management seem interesting. But
you are. See, Maktab Khan has such a fabulous job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without spoiling anything.
No, without spoiling anything.
The way that this gentleman bosses the painters around is something that needs to be there to be believed.
Yeah.
And so, I'm also very interested, since you brought up, of course, there's also a master calligrapher who these gentlemen report to, who has this very interesting title, the perfumed pen.
Yeah, Ambareen Kalam.
Yes.
I mean, how romantic and lyrical is that? These people knew how to do things in style. He's called Abdur Rahim Ambareen Kalam, which is like perfumed pen. So you can actually, you can actually see his calligraphy. And there's a portrait of him, by the way. A lot of these people painted themselves, painted each other. Some of them do double self-portraits.
So them painting themselves?
Yeah, and then painting. But there's some who do portraits of themselves in their self-portraits. And they become interesting characters. Yeah.
Well, so the reason I brought that up is because one thing that Mansur also does very well, and Mansur the book, not Mansur the painter, though he may have done that as well, is that there's this remarkable ability to bring to life the material culture of the Mughal court. So you're talking about, for example, these little seashells that he stores his paints in. Or you're talking about a particular perfume that's associated with a particular royal individual. And there's these vivid descriptions of gardens and the coolness of stone tiles, for example. And I'm interested also in figuring out how you managed to bring this material culture alive in such a profound way, because it does not really seem, as you're reading the book, that you're reading a book. It seems that you're suddenly, out of nowhere, you're suddenly in Mansur's life, and you're seeing and experiencing everything as this man did. So how did you manage to do that?
Thank you so much. How did I manage to do that? I just looked at the paintings very closely. That's all I did. And I'm not being... Each time you look at a Mughal miniature, something new reveals itself. And the wonderful thing about these paintings, almost all of them are in collections in museums far, far away, all under lock and key. Very few of them are actually on display. There's just a small handful I'm speaking specifically of this gentleman's works, are in the National Museum and in the Indian Museum. But they're replicas. There's a replica of a Bengal florican at the Venkatappa Art Gallery, which Venkatappa actually copied a Mansur original Bengal florican, which is in the Calcutta Museum. But each time you look at the paintings, why did I bring up this thing about museums? Every single one of them is available on the public domain now. Fortunately, all these museum collections are available, so not only can you, at the back of this book, there's a list of about 30 images which appear in the book. They merit very, very close appreciation and close looking at, and you can see them online very conveniently. The click of thing, and you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. That's where my stories came from. So from that point of view, my work was actually easy because I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to go anywhere. I just had to fill my head with all these voices and sit down and get on with the job. And then something does happen. Yeah.
It's interesting because I was having a conversation with Vikram Chandra this morning, and the second Vikram I've spoken to on this very same dais, and he mentioned this concept called, I think he called it the tar pit. Not very romantic, of course, but basically the same thing where he fills up his mind with these seemingly unconnected things. He just goes and travels, talks to people, looks at art, and
Yeah.
something happens that transforms them somehow into stories. And I mean, this is not a question, of course, just a general. It's just interesting that I suppose great minds do really think alike.
No, I think there's an overlap. It automatically happens when you're working so closely with the material. It's bound to respond to you in some way.
So we're almost out of time, but I think we have time for maybe one or two questions.
So the first thing that comes to my mind.
Salim Ali. Yeah, go on. Sorry. Go on.
The first thing that comes to my mind is, does Mansur hold a place in the ornithological societies or the zoological societies of, say, slightly later, the 1700s or something? Because
No,
somebody
probably
who has
not.
painted such beautiful, I mean, you mentioned Dodo and the Bengal Coracle, and I just saw the Dodo architect, and it's just so detailed. So.
See, and his paintings clearly, even if later painters hadn't actually seen them, the company painters of the late 1800s onwards, they did the Impy album, for example, has got these large-scale images of birds and animals, which were made for Lady Impy in Calcutta. They would have had some sort of an influence, although those are not miniatures. We're talking about images. Mansur's chameleon is precisely 11.1 centimeters by 13.2 centimeters. And it resides in the Royal Collection at Windsor. It's just this much.
It's
Yep. But to answer your question, I don't think he was actually recognized. I mean, he was one of the less well-known, in spite of his importance to the period and to the natural world at the time and to his patron. These are people who just get forgotten and slide away into...
Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, one more question. No, the lady up front,
Yeah.
please.
Hi. So I actually work with elephants, and I'm big time fan of your previous book, The Elephant Kingdom.
Oh,
So-
thank you.
And so it's a question to your themes, and also being a psychologist, you use so much of the archetypal. So I'm intrigued by what, not just with Mansur, I'm yet to read it, I'm very intrigued. What fascinates you, and it's beautiful that you are picking up these themes. So what gets you into this genre, be it with the elephants, be it with the birds, nature, and so, and how is it that you're combining? So my mind's running 120 miles
I'd love
per
to
hour.
hear what you have to say about that.
So, but
Yeah.
am I making myself clear?
Absolutely.
Yes. So
Well, personally, I've always liked animals. Yeah. So it starts there. I've always liked elephants, and I know it sounds terribly simplistic, but yes, I respond to animals, and hopefully they respond to me. So yes, I like working on these themes. And the other one is anonymity. People who have just been forgotten, and we need to actually look at them, right? It's not only about the greats. Because again, I again say, I like looking at it from a subaltern perspective rather than some. Yeah. Thank you.
On that note, I think we
Vikram,
are.
okay, sure.
So I think we're pretty much out of time, but I'm sure we'll be delighted to take questions after this. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.